Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on the Local Context Initiative and the new ArchivesSpace plugin developed by ArchivesSpace community member Joshua Shaw that integrates local context, traditional knowledge, and biocultural labels in ArchivesSpace. I'm Jessica Crouch, the Community Engagement Coordinator for ArchivesSpace, and I'm joined today by Dr. Jane Anderson, Maui Hudson, and Joshua Shaw. In this webinar, co-directors of Local Context, Dr. Jane Anderson and Maui Hudson, will give an introduction to the Local Context Initiative and newly launched Local Context Hub. Local Context is an initiative offering digital strategies for Indigenous communities, institutions, and researchers through the TK Traditional Knowledge and BC Biocultural labels and notices. Local Context is focused on increasing Indigenous involvement in data governance through the integration of Indigenous values into data systems. After, ArchivesSpace community member Joshua Shaw of Dartmouth College will demonstrate the Local Context integration plugin he developed that integrates local context labels and notices with ArchivesSpace. Joshua is requesting feedback from the ArchivesSpace community to ensure that the plugin works for a variety of institutions. Feature requests, bug reports, or suggestions for changes are encouraged. We will leave plenty of time for discussion and Q&A after the presentation, and we will hold all questions until the Q&A at the end. If you'd like to ask a question, we ask that you use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and questions will be read and answered during allocated time for Q&A. If you have a general question or need some other form of assistance, please feel free to reach out in the chat. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Jane and Maui.
Great. Thank you so much, Jessica. It's lovely to be here, and hello to everybody who's out there, those of you we know and those of you who are joining us for the first time. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, so we're going to begin by just talking a little bit, doing a small introduction to local context. I'm joining you from Lenape-Hoking in the lands of the Lenape Nations at NYU. And we're just going to do a short introduction and then hand it over to Joshua, who's going to give his presentation on the plugin that he's developed.
Kia ora, my name's Maui Hudson. I'm a member of the Whakatōhea Nation, which is one of the iwi here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, based on the lands of the Waikato Tainui people, and work at the University of Waikato. And alongside Jane, Kim Kristen at Washington State University, and James Francis Sr. from the Penobscot Nation, we're co-directors of Local Context. I guess part of the background for thinking about labels and thinking about the ways in which Indigenous people can gain greater control of their data and their knowledge comes about from the context of the shift towards open data and the increasing digitization of information. And of course, ArchivesSpace is sort of one of those platforms that supports that activity. There's a big movement around the FAIR principles and making sure that the data is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. That's really focused on the characteristics of the data itself. And so alongside that, the Indigenous data sovereignty movements like the Global Indigenous Data Alliance put together the CARE principles for Indigenous data governance as a complementary set of principles. And here you can see what they speak into: collective benefit, authority, control, responsibility, and ethics. And so in contrast to the FAIR principles, which are really focused on the characteristics of the data, they're more about the people and the purpose for which the data is being used. And this is really important when we think about some of these problems that Indigenous communities have with data and information systems. There's huge amounts of collections which Indigenous communities that come from Indigenous communities that sit within different archives and museums and libraries. Often the information that has been collected has been done by the researchers or the people that have pulled it together. And that often means that there's individual community names missing, provenance information is missing from that material. And so that has an impact on the way communities can engage with it. Similarly, they're usually not the legal rights holders, which impacts on their ability to be involved in kind of discussions around future use. And there are and this isn't just an issue for existing collections and historical collections, but we have more and more researchers that are collecting data and samples from communities now than ever before. And so if there is, I guess, the metadata structures, the information that, the frameworks that collect that information, if they're not conducive to including Indigenous metadata, then we're going to continue to have those mistakes perpetuated into the digital lives of the material as well.
So if Indigenous data sovereignty is kind of one of the key informing backgrounds to the development of local contexts, this particular problem around intellectual property and the ownership of Indigenous collections as part of a historical colonial condition is also kind of one of the key points of the background to the development of the labels. And certainly over the last 15 years, as we've worked with Indigenous communities, this request to have a tool that actually allows for Indigenous protocols, for Indigenous permissions, and for different kinds of histories to be recognised within these collections that isn't necessarily only about the property rights or the copyrights that sit with collections has been frequently requested. And so as a result, we set out developing something that really moves from ownership and control to establishing Indigenous cultural authority. And how do you do that in a way that allows it to become the metadata of particular kinds of collections? So as we've developed this project, we're kind of thinking about where do these collections sit and how and what are the different kinds of responsibilities that institutions and data repositories have to disclose not only the existence of those collections, but also some of the information or some of the missing information that's sitting alongside them as well. So this led to, in the last 6 years, the development of the local context notices functioning as a particular way of indicating engagement with Indigenous communities, as well as indicating and doing kind of some of this disclosure work. You can see we have 4 notices. We have an open to collaborate notice, and we have 3 disclosure notices: the attribution incomplete, biocultural notice, and the traditional knowledge notice. So just a couple of examples of institutions using the Open to Collaborate notice. We have the first one here is the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia. And Brian, if you're here with us today, hi, and thank you for all the work that you've been doing with us. This Open to Collaborate notice was added to the Center for Native American Indigenous Research to really make visible the work that the APS is doing with Indigenous communities, particularly around language collections, as well as to kind of disclose that there are Indigenous interests that sit here, and more collaboration and partnerships are invited to be part of this. This is the only way in which kind of moving forward, the extent of Indigenous interests can be recognised. This is an example of the Open to Collaborate notice being used at Simon Fraser University with one of their most frequented image archives in the library. Here, the notice has been added to indicate the work that the library is doing to work with First Nations communities to actually add proper attribution and information that sits with all these photographs. At the moment, that's not there, and they know that they need to do this work to kind of update and make sure that that proper attribution information is present within their archive and how it's presented to the public.
And this is an example of the biocultural notices. So where traditional knowledge notices mark interest in traditional knowledge, or where authority communities feel authority sits in relation to cultural heritage items or traditional knowledge. Biocultural notices mark their interest in relation to scientific collections and sort of genomic data sequences. So really thinking about Indigenous flora and fauna, things that are collected from their territories that become a part of science collections. And part of the shift from cultural heritage items, where there's often a really distinctive relationship between a community and the item in question, changes a little bit when you start thinking about sample or the scale of samples that can be collected. And so within this systematic collections database, which has been put together by Manaaki Whenua or Landcare Research, this has over 668,000 records. And we've been able to work with Landcare Research to have biocultural notices put on every single one of those records as that initial disclosure, and then leading into the ways in which they can engage with communities about labels being attached as well. And that's what one of the purposes of the notices is, to allow institutions to develop spaces or develop the infrastructure that allows the labels to come into place. So where the notices sit within the records and the activities that are put in place to allow that to be visualized and sit on the record, they can be replaced by either traditional knowledge notices or biocultural notices, depending on the context of its use.
So this is just an example of all the traditional knowledge labels and biocultural labels that we developed. We developed these labels very early as part of the first work that we did partnering with Indigenous communities. They were done before we developed the notices. But here you can see the kind of how they classified into provenance labels, protocol labels, and permission labels. This is an example of one of the TK labels, attribution label that is being utilized within the Skowlitz Band of the Stolo First Nation in what's currently known as British Columbia on their virtual museum. And you can see here how the labels are a little bit different to the notices in the sense that they are customizable by every community to really speak to the unique contexts, languages, and sovereign interests that every Indigenous community has. Here, the Skowlitz have customized their TK label. Almost every community utilizes the attribution label because it brings community names back into the record. And here they've also done that customization and the renaming of attribution in their own language as well, in Hunkamalum. This is an example of Passamaquoddy wax cylinder sound recordings that were the first sound recordings made on native lands in March 1890. This is a project that we had with Passamaquoddy and the Library of Congress to not only update an obviously impoverished record, but also to add the TK labels as a marker of present day Passamaquoddy Cultural Authority. So this is kind of what the record looked like when we began this work together. And this is the updated record, obviously just a screenshot of it. There's pages more information that's been added through this work with Passamaquoddy, not only the retitling of the songs, but also information about what those songs mean, when they would have been sung, and the different histories that kind of are embedded within this sound recording. You'll also see that there's the 3 traditional knowledge labels that Passamaquoddy have customized into their own language, as well as kind of keeping those labels as close to the sound recordings themselves. The Passamaquoddy didn't want those labels ending up in some other field that people wouldn't be able to see. They wanted that authority to be instantly recognizable by any kind of public that came to see these recordings or found these recordings in the Library of Congress website. What was important about this project was the ways in which the Library of Congress took on where the TK labels needed to be included in the rights advisory. They actually included the TK labels above the rights that were held by Peabody Museum, really indicating that that cultural authority is a present day authority and it persists across time. These are perpetual rights that the Passamaquoddy have to these songs. What's important about this intervention is that just recently the Peabody has asked for those rights to be taken out that I showed you in the previous slide, to actually be taken out of the rights advisory that they want, and it's clear that anybody seeking to use and to have permission to use these sound recordings should be directly working with the Passamaquoddy community. So of course, this led to different kinds of questions because there's never been a field to include Indigenous information. This led to certain kinds of questions about where should that be? What would that look like initially within the MARC record, because that's what we were dealing with at the Library of Congress. A decision to include the TK labels in the data field 540 was the decision that was made at the Library of Congress. Now that sits as a particular kind of standard for where the TK labels are added. And then the biggest change within this project has been the actual inclusion of a new field within the JSON record at the Library of Congress. What that means is that any community that has TK labels can have those labels added to the infrastructure, the digital infrastructure of those collections, and they won't have to do all the work that we did with Passamaquoddy to kind of make those changes possible. That's a huge contribution that the Passamaquoddy have made to every Indigenous nation that holds materials at the Library of Congress and would like to have those cultural rights and cultural authority recognised into the future.
Sorry, and so with the development of the biocultural labels, I described a little bit earlier about the sort of work that had been done thinking about Indigenous interests in relation to sort of scientific collections that were taken from their traditional lands, waters and territories, and whether the labels could be used in a similar sort of format. And that led us to develop biocultural labels, in part because they speak to a different sort of content. So where traditional knowledge and cultural heritage, or the cultural heritage items, have traditional knowledge associated with them, they often have particular protocols for sharing. What are the protocols for sharing scientific data, data sets or sample collections? And so our project started to think about the different types of labels that are needed for that context, and across the same areas, or the same sort of classes around provenance, protocols and permissions. And you see here the biocultural, the BC provenance label, very similar to how the TK attribution label is used, just bringing the name back into bringing the Indigenous community's name back into the collection. The importance of recognizing consent in that kind of environment, scientific environment, and whether consent is verified or not. And then the types of permissions that sit in place, particularly when we're thinking about adding labels to material that's sitting in an open data environment. And so what we just want to show here is an example of how whakatauhia labels, and whakatauhia is my community, have been applied to the material that comes from our territories that sit within the Manaaki Whenua Collections database. And this database has 5 national collections that have been pulled together over the last 100 years. You can see here that there's over 670,000 records that sit there, as we mentioned before, and you saw notices have been applied to each of those records. And currently there's around 2,000 records that have labels attached to them. It's a very similar way to how Jane was talking about with the Library of Congress, in that the work that's been done to put labels in place here is enabled it for every other community in New Zealand to do it. And so while at the moment there's only 2 communities that have done that, there's others that are moving down that path as well. And so here you can see one of the records. Because this is an open database, anyone around the world can get access to it. And on every record, you'll see both the notice, but also the connection to local context and how each of the collections has had a notice attached to it. And you see there where the notice has its unique ID. In terms of the Indigenous communities so far that have attached labels, there's Whakatohia, and you can see the 4 labels there that we chose, the provenance label, the research use label, and then the open to collaboration and open to commercialization. Ngāti Maru, one of the other iwi, have chosen the provenance label and the consent verified. And so when you're on the Manaaki Whenua's database, there's a range of different ways in which you can filter the material. They've added the native lands plugin to this, so you can filter it by traditional territories. This is the kind of the map view that shows the samples that are from Whakatohia. So this is sort of our territory in Aotearoa. And then you can go to the list view, and it gives you the record for each of those items, and click on the record and it will pull up the item, and each of the 1,200 items is represented like this with all of our labels on it, relating to specimens housed at Manaaki Whenua within Te Rohe o Whakatohia, which is within the Whakatohia territory. And this is the screenshot of the project information which Manaaki Whenua put in place. That's what generated the notice in the first place. That material was sent to the community account or Whakatohia's account. When it arrived, we looked at it, decided which labels we would put on it, and that should be on the next slide here. And when we attached our labels to it on the local context hub, then Manaaki Whenua used the API to pull these labels through onto the record. And here is the really just the registration for the local context hub. This is essentially the sort of third iteration in the development of local context over the last 15 years. Initially, it started with engaging with communities in a face-to-face manner to really customize the labels. The first TK label hub was focused on the communities and their ability to customize the labels online. And then they were able to send those to institutions. And our local context hub now allows both institutions and researchers to join the hub too, and to start to automate some of those processes. And this is the API which can be used to connect to the unique ID that's associated with each project. If the project's initiated by an institution, we'll have a biocultural notice, or we'll have a notice sitting on it. As that notice is replaced by labels, that's connected to the same ID, and the API will pull through either the notice or the labels if they've been attached, and that can be updated over time as well.
So thank you so much for joining us. That was a quick overview of local context and the labels, and I will stop sharing my screen and hand over to Joshua. So thank you again.
All right, hi everybody. I'm going to share my screen. And let's just get in the slideshow here. All right. So first off, thanks to Jane and Maui for giving us such a great overview of local context in general, the labels and notices, and how we should be using the hub to engage with Indigenous communities. Today, I'll be discussing a plugin I wrote that integrates the local context hub with ArchivesSpace so that labels and notices curated in the hub can be displayed in ArchivesSpace. I should note that all the workflows that you see in the plugin are predicated on your institution having a local context hub account and having started the process of reviewing your collections and working with the communities represented in those collections. So a bit of background on how I got here and how I started to think about developing the plugin. Dartmouth Library and the Hood Museum are recipients of a Mellon grant called Advancing Pathways for Long-Term Collaboration. And the grant's purpose is to advance significant cross-institutional and community-centered collaboration grounded in Dartmouth's Native American and Indigenous Arctic collections. One of the things that we discussed as we were sort of thinking about what the grant would entail was, could we use some of these traditional knowledge labels and notices in some of the collections that we have? So I started doing a little bit more research, contacted Jane and the rest of the team, and then started really working with them to think about how that would work in the context of ArchivesSpace. So a little bit of background about how Dartmouth, the sort of material that Dartmouth would be interested in using these sorts of, engaging with communities over. So in addition to the material related to the founding of Dartmouth, purportedly as a school for Native Americans, and there's a whole checkered past that surrounds that, we also hold a significant collection related to the Abenaki community. We are working with the Abenaki community to identify material that should be controlled by them, as well as identifying other concerns. And I hope that as this process continues with them, we can introduce the hub to that community, and then work with them as they create labels for the material in this particular collection. And I also want to note that Dartmouth is located on Abenaki ancestral lands and waterways. We also have a large set of polar collections, some of which contain rather troubling material related to the indigenous peoples of both the Arctic and Antarctic regions. We have sound recordings, imagery, and other ethnographic data that should be reviewed by the communities represented in the materials so that we can identify material where control should be returned to that community. Integrating the local context labels and notices and partnering with the communities to identify and return control of those materials is an example of the collaboration process that the grant is really focused on. So in designing the plugin, I worked, as I said, I worked closely with the local context team. And I want to give a specific shout out to Ashley Rojas and Diana Lovett. They were the two people that I worked most with. So onto the plugin itself. We're going to sort of narrow the focus a bit here. So the plugin provides staff users with the ability to link an object in ArchivesSpace with a local context hub project. And it uses the API that Jane and Maui mentioned. And the hub project ID, the unique ID that was pointed out, is the unique identifier that we use to link both of those applications. Resources, accessions, archival objects, and digital object components can all be linked to a specific project. The local context labels, notices, and other data associated with the project is then displayed in ArchivesSpace, both in the staff interface and in the PY. And I want to note that all the data you see in this presentation comes from the development API. So there's a lot of placeholders, lorem ipsum, basically just to demonstrate functionality. And you shouldn't view this as sort of, this is what a real thing, these aren't real, this isn't real data. So the installation process, and this is a little bit technical here. It does modify the database. So you'll need to run the standard setup database script before using the plugin. What it does is it adds a new object, a local context project object, to ArchivesSpace as a top-level independent type. It's similar to something like an event or an assessment. It also adds a new subrecord to accessions, resources, archival object, digital objects, and digital object components. And that subrecord is where a staff user can add a link to a local context project. The plugin overrides several core methods and views. So you want to take a look at the README for more specifics. But if you have other plugins or customizations that also override those same methods or views, you'll need to reconcile your changes with those in the plugin. The way that I usually do that is I take a look at the plugin that I'm using, or both plugins, or the set of plugins, and then basically merge those changes into a common space. All right, so now for the actual workflow. All users can view existing local context projects listed in our ArchivesSpace. And you can get there by clicking on the little gear icon next to the repository name, going down to plugins, and then choosing local context projects. And that's the same place where you'd find like the LCNAF plugin. So once you get there and go there, you go to that listing, you'll see that the list of all of the current projects listed in ArchivesSpace. It's a search view, so you can do the sort of minimal sorting and filtering that you would expect on that sort of view. If you have the necessary permissions, you can edit the project or create a new one. And I'll talk more about the cache, the reset cache button on the top right a little bit later. So from the list of the local context projects, you can view the details for a specific project. And this just gives you a sample view of that. And it's very similar to what you'd see on, again, something like an event. You have sort of the basic details and then a list of the linked records. You can also choose to view the details of that local context record from directly within the project details. The labels and notices are formatted for a somewhat nicer display, but you can also choose to view the entirety of the JSON data. And so this just gives you an example of what that would look like. On the left is sort of the formatted labels and notices, and on the right is the JSON data. I want to note that if labels can include translations, and they can also include audio. And if that's the case, then there's an additional spot for both those translations and that audio. And that audio is rendered in line with a native audio tag. And this is what a sort of sample of what that would look like in the staff interface. So what happens when you create a new local context project? So first off, you need to allow any user that you want to be able to do this to do it. And there's a new permission that's defined by the plugin. And you can manage those permissions in the same place you'd manage any other permissions. That's within the sort of groups list. And then you just go down, tick off this specific permission, and you're good to go. When you create a new local context project, you're asked for a couple bits of information. One is the project ID, and that's that unique identifier. And then the other is the project name. And this is sort of a user-supplied human readable name so that you can keep track of that. It could be the same, and probably should be, the same as the name supplied in the local context hub. One thing to note is that some hub projects are set so that their data is still private and not public or discoverable. So if that's the case, you probably want to untick that checkbox, and that basically tells the plugin not to try and fetch the data from the API. The hub doesn't support authentication right now, but if it does in the future, I'm planning to update the plugin so that the data for the hub projects that are private, basically we can authenticate to the API and pull that data back for viewing in the staff interface. So technical details. I've implemented a basic caching strategy so that we don't overwhelm the local context API when we view a record in ArchivesSpace. And so I'm going to get into the details of how that caching works a little bit. On startup, the plugin checks for and creates, if necessary, a new directory in the standard ArchivesSpace data directory, and we name it local context cache. And that's what you see in the image here. When a new project is created in ArchivesSpace, the plugin sends off a request to the API and then stores the return JSON data in that new directory that's been created. Each time a local context project data is viewed in ArchivesSpace, the plugin checks the locally cached copy to see if it's out of date. If it is, then the plugin runs off to the API, fetches new data, and replaces and updates the data that's stored locally. If it's not, if the data in the cached copy is still okay, it reads that cached copy and displays the data from that. The plugin also checks all existing cached projects on startup and refreshes the data if it's older than the configured cache times. And so cache times, they're managed with a configuration option. That's set to 7 days by default, except for the open to collaborate notice, which is set to 30 days. And the reasoning behind that is the open to collaborate notice, the language typically doesn't change all that often. And so 30 days was a more acceptable time frame for that. The API calls are rate limited so that we, again, don't overwhelm the local context API. And so you get, basically, it defaults to 30 seconds between queries to the API. And I would say before changing any of these defaults, you probably want to consult with the local context team just because we don't want to overwhelm their service. And we sort of tuned, I tuned these settings basically in collaboration with the team. These seem to be the sort of best default that would suit the majority of needs. So in addition to the automatic cache refresh, you can choose to refresh the cache for a project manually and sort of on demand. And this would be a use case where you know that a community is working on a project and they've updated the project labels and notices, for example. So you might want to manually fetch a new copy of the data. So this is that reset button that I mentioned on the listing of all the projects in ArchivesSpace. So you basically, if you click on that button, you get a list of all the projects in ArchivesSpace. You can choose to manually refresh one or more, or you can refresh the cache for all of them at once. That all at once refresh is managed as a background job, and it may take a little bit of time just because of that rate limiting that I mentioned. It's probably unlikely that you'll need to do this all refresh and really any manual refresh. There's also a cron job that's defined by the plugin that runs once every week at 1 a.m. and basically does the same cache checking to make sure that the data stored locally is fresh and within the defined cache time for a project. So this is sort of the workflow of what a staff user would see. Once you've created a local project, you can then link it to one or more records in ArchivesSpace. And so you can link it to, the usual set of suspects: resources, accessions, archival objects, digital objects, and digital object components. It's a standard interface, really what you'd see when you're linking an agent to a resource or an archival object, for example. Standard type ahead. One thing to note as you're doing this, because there are hyphens used in the project IDs, you want to include quotes around them because the type ahead doesn't like the hyphens. And that's sort of a standard gotcha in ArchivesSpace at the moment. You can add more than one project as a subrecord, but I think that would be extremely unlikely and probably very rare. But you can do that in the plugin. So once you've linked a project to as a subrecord to an object, a resource or an archival object or something, you can then also, once you've exited edit mode, you can then choose to, again, see the details about the local context data for that specific project. And again, you see, as we did on the view for the project itself, you can see the display of the labels and notices, and then the raw JSON data as well. This is where it gets a little bit tricky. Because of the way that ArchivesSpace works, we have the sort of tree, as we call it, where you have your resource, you have a series of archival objects underneath that, and it's in a hierarchical view of the data. So what I've done is implemented an inheritance, essentially, for the data for any linked project. So to explain that, let's take a look at this sort of simple example. We have a series in a resource that's directly linked to a project. And then that series has 3 files underneath it. 2 of the files are not directly linked to a project, but 1 file is directly linked to a separate project, a project separate from the series. The files that are not directly linked to a project themselves will actually inherit and display the data for the series, for the project linked to the series. And that display question is something that I'll get to a little bit later, because there's a difference in the implementation between the staff side and the PUI. But for right now, let's just focus on the way that the inheritance works. So those 2 files will get the series data inherited. They'll inherit that series data. The file with a directly linked project to it, so it's actually directly linked to a different local context project, that will actually display the linked project, the directly linked project data. And any children objects of that file will inherit that file's directly linked project data. And it's a little tricky, to wrap your head around this, but hopefully that illustrates how that inheritance is set up. This inheritance is all the data is gathered during the indexing process. So some questions that I have around this that I'd like to get feedback from the community on are, should this staff interface indicate that an object has an ancestor that is linked to a project? So for example, in this example, should the files that are not directly linked indicate that they have a series above them that is directly linked to the project? Should that file display the series data for the project? And if so, how and where would we display that data? So some questions that I have there. And hopefully we'll revisit this inheritance again when we get to the PUI side of things. And maybe that'll hopefully clear things up a bit if people still have questions. So exporting the project data. So a little bit more technical weeds here. I've modified the exports for both the staff side and the PUI. So the staff side, we already include modifications to the EAD and EAD3 exports. And I've worked with the local context team to sort of create a preliminary mapping between the local context labels and notices and EAD, EAD3 fields. Still a work in progress, so that's subject to change as we sort of finalize and work through those. MARC export modifications are planned. And again, I'm working with the local context team to map the labels and notices to the most appropriate MARC fields. And the Library of Congress has done a lot of work there, so we may be able to just wholesale pull their work in and call it a day. But I just need to review that with the local context team. PDF exports have also been modified. So the reason for that modification is that labels and notices really want that image that's associated with them along with the textual description to be displayed. And the current, the core transformation that the PDF display relies on does not actually render images in line. So the plugin provides an alternate version of that XSL transformation. And unless you've set a configuration option to not move that aside, the plugin will actually take the core version of the XSL style sheet, move it aside, rename it, and then put the plugin version in place. And that way the images will render in line when you do the PDF exports. Again, if you have made modifications to that XSL transformation, you'll need to reconcile and merge the two your changes with plugin changes. I know some people probably would be interested in what those actual mappings were, so I've provided that here. You can see that it's a very small subset of the EAD tags that are available, typically use restrict, access restrict, and custode history. But again, working with the local context team to finalize these, so we may need to change these a little bit in future. And again, just a reminder that the MARC mapping is also a work in progress. And here are just some samples of what those exports would look like. On the left is the sort of PDF export from the staff side, and on the right is an EAD export. One thing I'd like to point out is that each of these basically includes a timestamp that lets the user know when the local context hub data was harvested, so that they have an idea of the time frame for when this data is valid. They also provides a link directly back to the hub. And this is useful when you have, say, you've exported a PDF, it was a year ago. You don't know if this data is actually still correct because the community that's you've been working with may have updated the labels. They may have added new labels, they may have changed the language a little bit. So you always have a link back to that project on the hub that's sort of the project, the data of record, if you will. One additional option that I've added, a very simple basic report that allows you to essentially list all of the resources, accessions, archival objects, etc., that are linked to a project. And that gives you basically the project ID, the project name, title, and then what it's linked. and new reports in the same standard area. And this is another place where I'd love feedback. If people think of other use cases that would involve additional data, be really glad to hear that. So onto the PUI. The plugin updates the PUI view in a couple of different places. It adds the labels and notices images for the link project just under the record title. So you can see that in the illustration here. And then it adds an additional section in the body of the record where it displays the label image and then the label text, or label and notice text, depending on what that particular project has for components. Each of the images that are placed underneath the object title actually link down to that section. So it provides a really good way to upfront and let the user know that this record has a local context label or notice, and clues them into the fact that they need to look at this and find out more information. Again, if audio is included, that's rendered in line. If translations are included in the data, those are also provided. And we also provide, again, a link back to the project on the hub. And I want to, again, point out that this is an overridden view. So if you have other plugins or customizations that do that, you'll need to, again, reconcile and merge those changes together. Back to the inheritance that I mentioned. Again, just a reminder for people, link project data is inherited down the tree unless an object is itself linked directly to a project. And the PUI actually does display that inheritance. So the next slide is going to show you an example of how that would look for both a file that is directly linked and for a file that's not directly linked, that lives in a series that is directly linked. So here we go. The tree on the right shows you the sort of the tree structure. So you can see that you have an archival object without a local context project and one that does have a local context project. And then you can see the display for the series, where you can see the listing of the local context project information. The file that inherits that shows the same data, but also adds a note saying that it's inherited from the parent series. The file with its own project data displays a different set of local context data and does not display the series data. The Open Collaborate notice is a slightly special case, as I mentioned before, that I've set up to display on the PUI homepage, and that's controlled by another configuration option. If you set that to true, it will display the Open to Collaborate notice on the homepage, but you should, again, have an account on the hub where you've added this notice to your account, and then you can enable this on the PUI. Again, an overridden view, so you'll need to merge in your changes. I mentioned exports previously. The PDF exports from the PUI have also been overridden and modified so that they include the local context data. And again, like with the staff exports, labels and notices, you get the image plus the textual data. You also get a link back to the original hub project and the date that the labels and notices data was harvested on. Again, cueing a user into the fact that this is a static snapshot and that if they probably need to check to make sure that this is the most up-to-date information. One additional option, you can also enable faceting for the local context projects. And you can do this on both the staff and the PUI. Honestly, I don't know if it'd be useful for a researcher on the PUI side, but I can see the use on the staff side where somebody may want to see which records have been linked and get a list of that and maybe export that list for additional, research or something like that. And finally, projects available on GitHub. No official release yet because it's still sort of a work in progress, specifically with the exports. But it supports ArchivesSpace versions 3.11, 3.20, and 3.31. I've omitted 3.30 because I don't think anybody should actually be running that. Basically, what you need to do is clone the repo, check it out, And then check out the branch specific to the ArchivesSpace version you're running. The reason for that is the overrides that I've had to make in the plugin are sometimes specific to the version of ArchivesSpace that you're running. I would say that pull requests are encouraged. So if you find a bug or have a comment or anything like that, that would be great to know. And I'd be happy to take a look at those. And known issues, as I've mentioned, the EAD, EAD3 export mapping, MARC exports. I think there's room for more robust testing of translations display as well. And I would also encourage people that if they do check the plugin out, that you should run it in a development environment first. I've done extensive testing, but there's always the possibility for something that I've missed. So I would encourage people to run it in a development environment first. And again, we want feedback from other institutions because we want to make this work for everybody. So thank you. And here's my contact information, and I'm going to turn it back over to Jessica for the Q&A.
All right. Thank you, Joshua. And thank you to Jane and Maui. That was great. I said before we started, I was so excited because I learned a lot today and I have questions. So if you have questions, please feel free to drop them into the chat. In the meantime, Joshua, I'll share my screen in just a second. There's a great question. I mean, not in the chat. Put them in the Q&A, please. A great question in the Q&A from Brianna. How would you suggest an institution begins trying to use these notices and labels?
I'm happy to answer that one. So we recommend that institutions start by perhaps utilizing the Open to Collaborate notice in the first instance, and then to isolate a small collection that allows you to test out working with a community, as well as adding a notice to that collection. And that helps you create the workflow that your institution is going to need to both add notices and add labels.
Thanks. And Corey put into the chat, for anyone interested in getting started with Local Context Hub, please email us, support@localcontext.org. If there are any other questions, please do drop them in the Q&A. I'm going to go ahead. There are a couple questions that were answered during the presentation, but I'm going to read them out loud. On the BC labels for specimens, is this based on knowing the geolocation of the specimen? What if there might be an overlap with another community or different indigenous groups, entities for the same area? Maui did answer that in the example, it is based on knowing the location of the samples as per the map view. We work with native lands to ensure that samples that were located within overlapping areas would be available to both communities. Maui, is there anything else you want to add to that?
Yeah, there's just a couple of things. So one thing is that the way native lands operates, as well as it allows for, I guess, boundaries not being sort of fixed or kind of hard points, but being able to overlap. So you do get these areas, and so we had to work with them to make sure anything that sat within that overlapping area would be represented. There's also a multiple community label. And that's been put in place because often, even with cultural heritage items, they might have connections back to, a number of communities. And so a community can put their labels, or what they, indicate what their relationships with that item is with the use of their labels. But they can also indicate that there are other communities that might have an interest in it too. And that's what the multiple communities label represents.
Great, thanks. Another question that was in the chat, someone asked where to find the Library of Congress MARC mappings for TK Local Context Hub data, and Jane provided those links. If you are listening to this as a recording in the future, all of the Q&A will be provided with the recording. So if you're interested in those links, you can find those there. And then Naomi asked Joshua which versions the plugin ran on, and so he responded to that in the chat as well.
I'll just also add that if you scroll down in that record from the Library of Congress on Passamaquoddy, if you scroll down to the very bottom with the additional metadata formats, there's the MARC record, there's a MODS record, and there's a Dublin Core record as well that you can kind of look at in terms of where they have mapped the labels into all three of those.
Oh, that's great. That's a great example. Right. Any other questions? We have a few more minutes. But if no more questions come in the Q&A, obviously we don't have to stick around just to run out the clock. In the meantime, Jane, Maui, Joshua, anything you'd like to add or want to finish with?
I guess I would just begin by thanking Joshua for all of your work in relationship to building this plugin, as well as a shout out to our team, Ashley and Deanna, for to being there to support the work that you've been doing, Joshua. Really appreciate it, and particularly kind of understanding the conceptual work that has gone into building the local context hub and how unique it is. We've had to build this from scratch. There's never been anything like this. And just the kind of patience that you've had with us as we've kind of built the standards that then you're drawing upon for the plugin.
Yeah, and I would also say that I've really appreciated the working with the local context team and the sort of support that they've provided as I sort of worked through questions from my end about, okay, how do I do this in ArchivesSpace? How does this relate to the data that we're trying to display? And even some more of the conceptual issues that I've worked through, just because a lot of this was new to me. And so I've learned a lot in working with the team.
Hilda, and I just want to say too, I think it's really great to see where this has ended up as well. We've certainly been thinking about what are the stages that follow on from working with the community to get a sort of a notices or labels in place. What happens to that data after that, and what sorts of connections and links need to be built. And so the sort of activity that's been done with ArchivesSpace here is important, and we can see that it needs to happen not only just for kind of other platforms, but as that sort of data and content gets shared more broadly, just working out ways that that material sits with it. And so some of the thinking around inheritance is really useful as well. And there'll be things that we have to work out as we go along. So really taking just moving along slowly and sort of step towards thing, and really happy to work in with people to solve the inevitable challenges that come up as we move along, as we move forward. So kia ora.
Well, thank you everyone, and yeah, what everyone has been saying, it's so exciting to see the community come together and do such good work, and I'm really excited about this. Same thing Joshua said. I learned a lot. I'm learning a lot, and it's just so exciting to see another cool plugin, Joshua. And yeah, so Joshua does say in the chat that he's hoping that maybe this could be moved into core code or something in the future, which obviously would be wonderful. There are some other questions popping up in the chat. We're past time, so I don't want to spend too long time talking about this. Marcella has a question about customizing inheritance. Marcella, maybe you could post that to the listserv, or we could get some discussion going around that, because it would be great to hear the answer to that. And then I'm noticing that Jane has answered some other questions as well.
Yeah, so I can jump in on
Yeah.
the inheritance.
Okay.
Yeah, that's one of those tricky ones where certainly the way that the plugin currently works is probably my bias, and sort of uses some of the techniques that I've used for other plugins. Because it's a fairly simple add-on to the indexer, it could be customizable. The simple answer would be you could turn it on or turn it off. I think in working with the local context team, though, the preference was to have that inheritance shown, just because if you have something, say, listed at a series level, you want to indicate to people that the material that's contained within that series, so the files and items or what have you, also have the same control issues and potential restrictions that are indicated by the labels and notices. So I think that while it's technically feasible, I think that would be a conversation we'd want to have with the local context team and probably in the wider community.
Thanks, Joshua. All right, we are past time and people are starting to drop off. So we'll go ahead and end there. But again, thank you so much to all of our presenters. Thank you to Jane and Maui, and thank you, Corey, for being in the chat and taking care of things in the chat and keeping me honest. And to great ArchivesSpace citizen Joshua for another great plugin. The recording of this session will be made available in the coming days. We'll be sure to include links to slides, as well as links to all of the resources that have been mentioned throughout this webinar, as well as a copy of the chat, so you'll be able to see things in the chat. But with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up. Again, thank you to our presenters. Thank you to everyone who attended. Thank you to everyone who is still here until the bitter end. And I will see you at the next ArchivesSpace event. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.